The warning. The city was alive with the hum of evening traffic, a constant rhythm that kept the streets pulsing with life. As the sun dipped beneath the towering skyline, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the usual sounds of rush hour were interrupted by a sharp voice. It sliced through the air like a sudden gust of wind, causing pedestrians to halt in their tracks, eyes darting around trying to locate the source. "Don't eat that." The boy's voice rang out, loud and desperate, cutting through the usual buzz of the city. People froze, momentarily stunned by the abruptness of the outburst. Their gazes were drawn to the small figure standing on the edge of the bustling street, wedged between the sharp lines of sleek glass buildings and a row of high-end boutiques. A boy, no older than 11, his clothes a mismatched patchwork of worn fabric, his face smeared with the dirt and grime of city life. But despite the dirt and raggedness of his appearance, his eyes were sharp, focused, and full of a quiet intensity. He wasn't looking at the crowd. His gaze was fixed on one person in particular, a man seated outside a luxurious bistro, poised to enjoy an elegant dinner. Jacob Hart, the man he had locked eyes with, was a figure of wealth and influence. Tall, with sharp features and dressed in an immaculate tailored suit, he was the epitome of success. His life had been crafted from the ground up, a story of brilliance, ambition, and endless drive. He sat at the bistro, hands folded casually as he prepared to take his first bite of a meticulously plated meal, a dish that promised both sophistication and taste. But as he lifted his fork, about to dive into the grilled salmon glistening with a delicate glaze, something stopped him. The boy's words were as urgent as they were bizarre. "Your wife. She put poison in it," he added, his voice trembling with an emotion Jacob couldn't place. Jacob's brow furrowed as his fork hovered midair. A flash of irritation sparked inside him, but it was swiftly followed by a wave of disbelief. Poison. The boy had to be joking, or worse, crazy. He scanned the crowd for any signs of laughter, hoping to dismiss this bizarre interruption, but what he found was an unsettling silence. People weren't laughing. In fact, they were staring at him, their faces frozen in curiosity, their attention drawn to the unfolding scene. The sudden shift in the atmosphere made Jacob's pulse quicken. For a moment, he could feel his control slipping away. He had always walked through life knowing exactly where he stood, his success and confidence solidifying his place in the world. But now, as he looked around, a strange chill ran down his spine. Something about this wasn't right. He glanced down at his plate again, the salmon, so expertly prepared, the sautéed vegetables that complemented the dish perfectly. It looked so innocent, so enticing. How could anyone think it was poisoned? Then his mind drifted to her. Ava, his wife of 15 years, the woman who had stood by him through the long nights of building his empire. They had been a team, once inseparable, partners in every sense of the word. She had always been there for him, comforting him when he doubted himself, pushing him when he hesitated, and celebrating every victory as though it was her own. But lately, things had changed. A subtle shift had crept in between them, a growing distance that Jacob couldn't explain. He remembered moments when Ava would stare at him across the dinner table, her gaze distant, lost in some unfathomable thought. She had started spending more time away from him, taking long walks alone, disappearing for hours at a time, sometimes at odd hours of the night. At first, he hadn't thought much of it. Maybe she just needed space, a break from the relentless pace of their lives. But as time passed, the distance between them had only grown, and Jacob had started to feel something else, something he hadn't noticed before. A nagging feeling that she was slipping away from him, that she was no longer the woman he had once known so well. But poison. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was absurd, impossible. His gaze shifted back to the boy, who was still standing there, watching him intently. The boy's clothes were tattered, and his face was streaked with dirt, but there was something in his eyes, something more than just a desperate plea for attention. It was like he knew something Jacob didn't. "Why?" Jacob finally asked, his voice quiet but filled with an edge of curiosity that he couldn't suppress. Why would she do that? The boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, eyes locked on Jacob's. There was no fear in the boy's expression, only the weight of knowledge, as if he had seen something he wished he could unsee. Jacob's mind raced, memories of Ava's increasingly cold demeanor flashing before him. Had she really grown so bitter? Had the years of sacrifice, the late nights, and the relentless pursuit of success pushed her to this point? To the point where she might harm him? A sudden pain twisted in Jacob's chest as a thought occurred to him. What if this wasn't just about the business, the empire, or the money? What if it was about her, about the years of neglect, the isolation that had built up in their marriage? Had she reached a breaking point? A voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and urgent. "I'm serious," the boy said. "Don't eat it. She's trying to kill you." The finality in his words sent a wave of nausea through Jacob. The crowd had fallen silent, their eyes now glued to him, waiting for his reaction. Jacob was aware of the eyes on him, but the weight of the boy's words consumed him. Jacob's grip on his fork tightened. For a moment, he thought about brushing the boy off, about laughing this whole thing away. But the words stuck with him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He felt a deep sense of unease, a pull in his gut that he couldn't ignore. What if there was something to this? What if the boy was right? As the minutes ticked by, Jacob's mind spun, his thoughts a tangle of doubt, guilt, and fear. He had always prided himself on being in control of every aspect of his life, from the boardroom to his personal relationships. But now, standing in the middle of a bustling street, with the boy's warning echoing in his ears, Jacob was no longer sure of anything. What did he really know about Ava? Had he truly seen her, or had he been too caught up in his own world to notice the cracks that had started to form? The boy's voice broke through his thoughts once more. "You need to leave, before it's too late." Jacob's hand shook slightly as he set his fork down, his appetite suddenly gone. The warmth of the evening had faded, and the city, once alive with possibility, now felt cold, unfamiliar. And for the first time in years, Jacob Hart, the billionaire, felt vulnerable. The unraveling. Jacob stood there, staring at the boy, unsure of what to do. The once certain world he had built seemed to be slipping through his fingers, like sand in an open hand. His thoughts were a whirl of confusion and fear. The idea of his wife, Ava, plotting against him, seemed outlandish, preposterous. Yet deep within, a gnawing suspicion stirred, fueled by the boy's relentless gaze and the panic that now simmered in the air. For a moment, Jacob felt a sense of vertigo, like he was teetering on the edge of some precipice, not knowing whether to fall or step back. His mind raced back to the first years of his marriage, when everything had felt right, when Ava had been his rock. But now, the cracks in their relationship, which had once been easy to ignore, were suddenly glaring. "Leave it alone, kid," Jacob finally muttered, his voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. He tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. He stood up from the bistro table, shoving his chair back with more force than he intended. The clatter of the chair against the floor seemed to snap the spell that had fallen over the crowd, and a murmur spread among them. The boy didn't flinch, didn't step back. He simply stood there, his face resolute, his eyes still locked onto Jacob. "You don't understand," the boy said, his voice quieter now, but filled with an eerie certainty. "She doesn't want to just hurt you. She wants you gone. She thinks it'll make everything better, but it won't. Not for her, not for you." The words hit Jacob harder than anything he could have expected. His mind stuttered in disbelief, and his pulse quickened. He had never known the boy before, never seen him in his life. And yet, the weight of the warning felt too heavy to ignore. With a bitter laugh, Jacob ran a hand through his hair. "I don't even know you," he said, his voice a mix of frustration and confusion. "What do you think you know about my life?" About me and my wife. The boy shook his head, his expression unwavering. I know enough, he said softly, his eyes filled with an old weary wisdom that Jacob couldn't place. You've built your empire, but you've built it on her back. And she's tired. She's been tired for a long time. You've been too busy building walls around yourself to notice her breaking. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. The boy's words rang true in a way that chilled him. He knew that his relationship with Ova had changed, but he hadn't seen the extent of it. He had been so caught up in his work, his ambition, his endless chase for more, that he had stopped seeing the woman he married. Ava had always been there for him, always supported him, but in recent years, something had shifted. The boy's voice cut through his thoughts once more. You need to leave. Right now. If you stay here, you'll eat that food. And it'll be too late. Jacob looked down at the salmon again. The perfectly prepared dish suddenly seeming less like a meal and more like a trap. His stomach churned, and he felt an overwhelming wave of doubt flood over him. Could it be true? Could his own wife have gone so far? For a brief moment, Jacob considered ignoring the boy, laughing off his warning, and dismissing it as the ramblings of someone who didn't know any better. But deep down, something told him that if he ate that meal, it would be his last decision. I don't have time for this, Jacob muttered, more to himself than to the boy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, tossing them onto the table. Take the money and get out of here. The boy didn't move. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. You don't get it, he said, his voice trembling now. You've got no idea what she's been planning. I've seen her. I've heard her. This isn't just a game. She wants you dead. And I can't let that happen. The urgency in the boy's voice hit Jacob like a slap in the face. He took a step back, feeling a deep, unsettling chill creep up his spine. The boy's words seemed insane, yet they gnawed at the edges of his mind. He had never been one to believe in fate or destiny, but this moment felt too important to ignore. The crowd around them was growing, people whispering, craning their necks to get a glimpse of the strange scene unfolding before them. Jacob, feeling the eyes of the city on him, ran a hand over his face in frustration. What was he supposed to do? For a long, agonizing moment, Jacob stood frozen. He felt trapped, caught between the strange warning of a homeless boy and the normalcy of his life. Finally, he did the only thing he could think of. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked away from the table. The boy didn't follow him. Instead, he simply stood there, watching as Jacob made his way through the crowd. As Jacob disappeared into the flow of people, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something had just started to unravel. Later that night, when Jacob arrived at his penthouse, he tried to push the bizarre encounter from his mind. He entered the dimly lit foyer, the familiar sound of his shoes clicking against the polished floor the only noise in the quiet apartment. His thoughts, however, were still clouded with the boy's words. The warning, the poison, Ava. He glanced around the spacious, luxurious apartment, which had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the chaos of the world outside. But tonight, it felt cold. It felt hollow. As he made his way into the living room, he saw her, Ava, sitting by the window, a glass of wine in her hand, staring out at the city lights below. She hadn't heard him come in, and for a moment, Jacob just stood there, watching her. She seemed so distant, so far away, as if she were lost in a world that didn't include him. Ava. He called out softly, his voice hesitant. She didn't turn around right away. When she did, her face was calm, almost impassive, but there was something in her eyes that Jacob couldn't quite read. You're home early, she said, her voice flat. Jacob didn't know how to start the conversation. How could he explain the strange warning he had received? How could he tell her that he was beginning to wonder if everything he had known about their relationship was a lie? Ava, he began, taking a step closer. There was a boy today, at the bistro. He said something strange. He told me you put poison in my food. Ava blinked, her expression unreadable. Poison. She laughed, the sound hollow, almost mocking. And you believe him? Jacob hesitated. He didn't know what to believe anymore. I don't know, he admitted, his voice tight. But I have to ask, Ava, what's going on with us? You've been distant, cold. You've changed, and I haven't been paying attention. Ava's eyes flickered with something. Was it guilt? Fear? Before her lips curled into a bitter smile. You think I've changed? She asked, her voice laced with venom. Maybe it's not me who's changed, Jacob. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's you who's been too busy chasing your own success to see the damage you've done. Jacob felt the weight of her words, the sting of truth cutting through the air like a blade. For the first time in years, he realized that he had been blind, consumed by his ambition, his empire, his endless pursuit of more. And in the process, he had lost the most important thing in his life. Ava, I don't know what's happening between us, Jacob said, his voice raw with emotion. But I want to fix it. I want to try. Ava didn't answer immediately. She just sat there, her face unreadable, the glass of wine still held loosely in her hand. For a long time, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy between them, suffocating. Jacob wasn't sure if he had saved himself tonight, or if he had just opened a door to something darker. All he knew was that the truth was starting to unravel, and it was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The truth beneath the surface. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Jacob stood there in the cold, sterile light of the penthouse, trying to make sense of the tension that had built up between him and Ava. The arguments, the silent dinners, the long nights where they'd hardly spoken. All of it suddenly felt like a dam breaking, flooding him with questions he'd been too busy to ask. How had it come to this? What had happened to the woman he had once known so intimately? Ava sat across from him, still silent, her face an unreadable mask. Her fingers lightly traced the rim of her wine glass, the motion so mechanical that it made Jacob's stomach turn. Her gaze was fixed on something far beyond him, as though she were seeing a different reality altogether. It was as if he no longer existed in her world, and perhaps, in some strange way, he hadn't for a long time. Ava, Jacob began again, his voice steady but thick with emotion. I need to understand. I need to know what's going on with us. With you. You've been different, and I've been so consumed by everything else that I never asked why. She turned to him then, her eyes finally meeting his, but there was something cold in them, something distant that he couldn't bridge no matter how hard he tried. What's going on with us? She repeated, her voice surprisingly calm. Jacob, don't you know? You've been so wrapped up in your empire, your software, your world of acquisitions and meetings, that you forgot about me. You forgot about us. Her words hit Jacob with a force he wasn't prepared for. He'd always prided himself on providing for her, on building a life that was supposed to be everything she wanted. But now, standing in front of her, he saw how hollow his efforts had been. His achievements, his successes, the empire he had created, none of it had mattered if he had failed to pay attention to the woman beside him. Ava, the woman who had once been his equal, his partner in everything, was now a stranger to him, a shadow of the person he had loved so deeply. I didn't forget about you, Jacob said, his voice faltering slightly. I've just been trying to make sure we're okay. I've been working so hard for us, for our future. Ava let out a short laugh, bitter and mocking. For us. Jacob, you've been working for yourself, for your own image, your own success. You've turned me into a ghost. You've turned everything into a business transaction. You've forgotten what it's like to live together, to care for each other. You've forgotten what it's like to be a husband. Her words stung, sharper than any physical blow. Jacob swallowed hard, the weight of her accusations sinking deep into his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he was on the outside, looking in at a life he had once thought was his. The relationship he had taken for granted had deteriorated, crumbled under the weight of his own selfishness, and he hadn't even noticed. "I'm sorry," Jacob whispered, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "I never meant to hurt you." Ava's gaze softened for a brief moment, but the hardness in her eyes remained. She took a long sip of her wine, the glass trembling slightly in her hand. "It's too late for sorry, Jacob," she said, her voice quieter now, almost as if the fight had left her. "I've been drowning in your absence for so long that I can't remember what it was like to feel seen by you. I'm not sure I want to anymore." Jacob felt his chest tighten, the air around him thickening. Ava's words felt like a death sentence to the life he had worked so hard to build. He had been so consumed by ambition, by the need to succeed and be the best, that he had neglected the one person who had always been there for him. The realization hit him hard. He had lost her long before the boy at the bistro had spoken. "Ava, please," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I've messed up. I know I've been a terrible husband, but I want to make it right. I want to fix what's broken." Ava's eyes met his again, and for a moment, Jacob thought he saw a flicker of something. Sadness, perhaps, or even longing, but it was gone in the blink of an eye. She set her glass down with a soft clink and stood up, walking over to the large windows that looked out over the city. The lights twinkled below, a reflection of the life they had once shared, now seemingly out of reach. "It's not just about fixing things between us, Jacob," she said, her voice distant, as though she were speaking to someone far away. "You can't fix what's been broken for so long. It's about who we are, who we've become. And I'm not sure I like who I've become, not anymore." Jacob took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt so helpless in his life. The woman he had loved with all his heart seemed so far away now, as if she had become a stranger in her own skin. The realization hit him. He had been too blind to see the changes in her. And now it was too late to turn back. "I don't know what you want me to say, Ava," Jacob admitted, his voice raw. "I just want to fix this. I want to be there for you. I want us to be a team again, like we used to be." Ava turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "A team," she repeated, her lips curling into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Jacob, we haven't been a team for years. You've been the CEO of your empire, and I've been the trophy wife who's expected to smile and play the part. But that's not who I am, and it's certainly not who I want to be anymore." Her words pierced through Jacob like a blade. He had always thought that Ava was content with the life he had provided for them. He had thought that their partnership, their marriage, was enough. But now, standing in front of her, he realized just how far he had fallen short. Ava wasn't just unhappy. She was broken, and it was his doing. "I never saw it," Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never saw what was happening to you. I've been so focused on myself, on my business, that I never stopped to ask how you were feeling. I was so blinded by my own success that I didn't see you slipping away." Ava's eyes softened, just for a moment, before she turned back to the window. The silence between them felt heavy, suffocating. Jacob's heart ached as he watched her, the woman he had loved, now so distant, so unreachable. He had no idea how to fix this, no idea how to mend the rift between them. All he knew was that he had to try, even if it meant breaking himself open to the truth that he had been running from for so long. As the minutes passed, Jacob felt the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. The boy at the bistro had spoken the truth. He had seen what Jacob had been too blind to notice. Ava had been struggling, alone, for far longer than he could have imagined. And now, as the reality of their broken marriage began to settle in, Jacob knew that he couldn't ignore the pain he had caused any longer. But as much as he wanted to fix everything, to make everything right, there was one thing he knew for sure: he couldn't do it alone. And in that moment, he realized that the key to saving their marriage wasn't just about his actions, his words, or his apologies. It was about understanding the depth of Ava's pain, truly seeing her again, and working together to rebuild what had been lost. Meanwhile, outside their penthouse, on the cold, dark streets of the city, Leo stood alone, watching the building from a distance. He had done what he could for Jacob, warned him when he had a chance. But now, as he stood there in the shadows, Leo felt something stirring within him, a sense of relief mixed with guilt. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? He had saved Jacob's life that night, but had he saved Ava from herself? Leo couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than what he had witnessed from the sidelines. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if Jacob and Ava's relationship could ever be repaired. All he knew was that tonight had been a turning point for both of them, and for better or for worse, nothing would ever be the same again. A fractured reflection. The days that followed the confrontation were some of the most agonizing Jacob had ever lived through. It felt as though he were walking through a fog, each step uncertain, every moment suffocating with the weight of his guilt. Ava had barely spoken to him since that night. There were no more late-night conversations, no more soft laughter shared over dinner, no more of the intimate silences that once filled their home. Their penthouse, once a symbol of everything they had achieved together, now felt like a cold, distant monument to a love that had withered in the shadows of ambition. Jacob tried, with all his might, to bridge the gap that had opened between them, but Ava remained locked within herself, distant and guarded. He made attempts to engage her, to talk through the issues, but every time he approached, the distance between them seemed to grow wider. It was as though she was a person he once knew, but no longer recognized. Each day, Jacob found himself battling the realization that everything he had worked for, everything he had built, felt meaningless without Ava by his side. The software empire, the wealth, the power, all of it seemed hollow now. The empire that was supposed to provide for them, to elevate their lives, now felt like a cage, trapping them both in roles they no longer fit into. Jacob had been so focused on building his legacy that he hadn't realized he was losing the one person who had been with him from the beginning. He had always been the architect of his own world, the one who made decisions and plotted the course. But now, for the first time, he felt utterly powerless. It wasn't just his marriage that was falling apart. It was his identity, his sense of self. Who was he, if not the man who had conquered the corporate world? What was the point of all his success if it had cost him the most important relationship in his life? Ava, on the other hand, had retreated further into her own world. The last few weeks had been a blur for her, a painful haze of memories and regrets. She had spent so many years following Jacob, supporting his dreams, building their life together. But somewhere along the way, she had lost herself. She had poured all of her energy into their relationship, into making sure he had everything he needed, that their life together was flawless. But in the process, she had disappeared. Her desires, her passions, her sense of purpose, they had all been sidelined in favor of Jacob's empire. The woman she had once been, the confident, ambitious woman who had stood beside Jacob as an equal, had slowly faded into the background. She had become a spectator in her own life, watching as Jacob's success grew, while her own dreams and aspirations withered. And now, as she sat in their empty living room, the weight of all those unspoken years crushed her. The guilt she felt was suffocating, but it wasn't just for herself, it was for him too. Ava had spent so much time resenting Jacob for what he had become, for what he had neglected, that she had lost sight of how deeply his own actions had hurt him. His work, his ambition, had been his escape, his way of avoiding the cracks in their marriage. But in doing so, he had inadvertently trapped them both in a cycle of neglect and misunderstanding. And now she found herself wondering if it was too late to fix it. For the past few nights, Ava had been taking long walks, her mind constantly turning over the same thoughts. But one night, she found herself walking to a part of the city she hadn't visited in years. It was the old park near the river, a place where she and Jacob used to go when they were younger, when their love was new and everything felt possible. The park was nearly empty now, save for a few stray figures walking along the paths. But as Ava sat on the bench near the water, She felt something stir inside her, a faint spark of the woman she used to be. She closed her eyes, letting the cool evening air wash over her. And for a moment, the weight of everything seemed to lift. There was no empire here, no meetings or deadlines, no pressures to succeed. It was just her, alone with her thoughts. For the first time in years, Ava allowed herself to reflect on her life without the filter of her marriage to Jacob. She remembered what it was like to have dreams of her own, to have a sense of self outside of being a wife, a partner, an extension of Jacob's success. And in that moment, Ava realized something that had been buried deep within her for so long. She didn't know who she was anymore. She had lost herself, and that loss wasn't something that could be fixed by apologies or grand gestures. It was something she had to reclaim on her own. Back at the penthouse, Jacob sat in the dark, staring out the window. The city lights below flickering like a sea of forgotten promises. The coldness of the room mirrored the emptiness inside him. He had done everything he could to reach out to Ava, but it felt like she was slipping further away with each passing day. The boy's warning echoed in his mind. You've forgotten what she's been through. You've forgotten what you've done. Jacob had spent years building his empire, chasing success, chasing power, but now it was clear that he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered. He had neglected his wife. Ava wasn't just a figure beside him. She was the foundation of everything they had built together. And now, with the empire growing larger and more powerful each day, Jacob felt the emptiness of that success more acutely than ever. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant, asking if he was ready for the meeting in the morning. But Jacob's mind was too far gone, lost in the fog of his own mistakes, to care about the meeting. He could no longer bring himself to care about the deals, the contracts, or the numbers. They didn't matter anymore. A knock on the door broke the silence. Jacob looked up, startled. It was rare for anyone to visit at this hour, and the visitor wasn't someone he was expecting. He rose from his seat and walked over to the door, unsure of who it could be. When he opened it, he found Leo standing in the hallway, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his face a mixture of determination and uncertainty. The boy had been quiet ever since their encounter at the bistro, but something about Leo's presence now felt like a shift in the air. "Leo," Jacob asked, his voice rough with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Leo didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped into the apartment, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the luxury that surrounded them. He had been in this building before, but it was different now. It felt like a cage, not a home. "I had to come," Leo said finally, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I saw what happened, and I couldn't just leave it. You need to understand something." Jacob raised an eyebrow, confused. "What do you mean?" Leo took a deep breath, stepping forward. "You've been given a chance, Jacob. You've been given a second chance, but it's not just about saving your marriage. It's about saving yourself. You've been so focused on your empire, on everything that doesn't matter, that you forgot about the things that do." Jacob stared at Leo, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just about Ava anymore. It was about the man he had become, the man he had let himself turn into. A man consumed by his own success, a man who had lost touch with the very essence of life. The boy, the homeless child with nothing, had seen something Jacob hadn't. Ava hadn't been the only one who had been hurting. Jacob had been drowning in his own neglect, too proud, too focused on his empire to see the cracks forming around him. Leo's eyes softened slightly, as if he understood the depth of Jacob's internal struggle. "You need to make a choice, Jacob. You can either keep building your empire and let everything else crumble, or you can stop and rebuild everything, starting with the person you've lost along the way. Ava is hurting, but so are you. Don't keep pretending that success will save you." Jacob felt a strange wave of clarity wash over him, as if the fog that had surrounded him for so long had finally started to lift. He wasn't just losing Ava, he was losing himself. and that realization hit him harder than anything else. "Thank you, Leo," Jacob whispered, his voice full of gratitude, though he didn't know what the future held. He only knew one thing. The journey ahead would require more than just fixing his marriage. It would require him to rebuild himself, to become a man worthy of the life he had once dreamed of. And as Leo turned to leave, Jacob knew that for the first time in years, he had a chance to reclaim something that had been lost, the possibility of a life that was more than just success. It was a life of connection, of redemption, and perhaps of love. But that path would be long, and he would have to walk it alone for a while. The crossroads. The morning sun rose with a quiet intensity, casting a soft golden glow over the city below. Jacob stood by the window, looking out over the sprawling landscape, but his mind wasn't focused on the view. Instead, it was filled with a whirlwind of thoughts. Thoughts about his marriage, about Ava, and about himself. The weight of Leo's words still hung in the air like a cloud that refused to disperse. Jacob had spent his entire life building something that felt so important, so monumental. Yet, as he stood there, looking out at the world he had created, he realized it all seemed incredibly fragile now. A knock at the door broke the silence, and Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He knew who it was before he even opened it. Ava had been quiet for days, ever since their last conversation. But this morning, something had shifted. He felt it, deep within himself, a longing for resolution, for connection, for the possibility of healing. He opened the door, and there she was, Ava, standing in the hallway, her expression unreadable. She was dressed casually, a soft sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. There was no makeup on her face, and for the first time in days, she seemed more like the woman Jacob had fallen in love with, someone unburdened by the weight of their fractured relationship. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, taking each other in, the silence between them pregnant with so many unspoken things. Jacob's heart thudded in his chest, uncertain of what to say. He had so much to apologize for, so much to explain. But he knew words alone wouldn't heal the deep wound between them. Ava broke the silence. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice steady but soft, as if the weight of their past conversations still hung over her words. Jacob stepped back, wordlessly inviting her in, and they both made their way into the living room. As they sat down on the couch, Ava folded her hands in her lap, her fingers nervously tapping against her own palm. Jacob could see the tension in her body, the way she held herself, as though she were bracing for something. The air between them was thick with expectation, but neither of them knew exactly where to begin. "Ava," Jacob started, his voice tentative, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us. I've been thinking about what's been happening between us, and I realize now, I haven't been the husband you deserve. I've been so caught up in my work, in my own success, that I've completely neglected you, and I'm so sorry. I should have seen what was happening. I should have been there for you." Ava turned her head slightly, but didn't say anything immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, her lips pressed together in a tight line. Jacob could feel the weight of her silence. He couldn't tell if she was listening, if she even believed him, or if the distance between them had grown too wide to be bridged. "I know it's not enough to say I'm sorry," Jacob continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But I want you to know that I'm here now. I want to fix this, Ava. I want to fix us. I want to understand what you've been going through. I want to listen." Ava's eyes flicked up to meet his, and there was a brief moment of vulnerability in her gaze. She took a deep breath, the kind of breath someone takes when they know a painful truth is about to be revealed. "Jacob," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not just about you being busy. It's not just about you being caught up in your work. That's part of it. But the truth is, I've been drowning for so long. You've been so absorbed in your world, and I've just been here, watching." Jacob felt a pang in his chest. He had always known that things weren't perfect, but he had no idea how deep Ava's pain ran. She had been silently suffering, and he hadn't seen it. He hadn't felt it. Ava's voice wavered, but she pushed forward. I've been invisible, Jacob. I've been living in a life that wasn't mine. I was content to support you, to stand by your side, but somewhere along the way, I forgot who I was. I became just the wife, the one who smiled when she was supposed to, who played the part because that's what you needed. But I lost myself in the process, and I resented you for it. I resented you for not noticing. Jacob's throat tightened, and he could feel the tears welling up behind his eyes. But he held them back. Ava, I never meant to make you feel invisible. I never meant to take you for granted. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I succeeded, if I made sure we had everything, that would be enough for both of us. But I was wrong. Ava shook her head, her eyes welling up, but she quickly wiped the tears away. I know you didn't mean to hurt me, but you did. And I've been angry, so angry, because I spent all these years feeling like I didn't matter. And now, I'm not sure where that leaves us. Jacob reached out for her hand, but she pulled back just slightly, her gaze not leaving his. I know I failed you, Ava, he said softly, his voice full of remorse. I've failed to see you, to hear you. I've been so focused on what I wanted, on what I thought would make everything better, that I neglected the one thing that really mattered, the person I love. Ava looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then finally, she spoke again. Jacob, I don't know what to say. I don't know if I can just forgive you, just like that. It's going to take time. But you need to understand that this isn't just about fixing what's broken between us. It's about rebuilding what we were, and more importantly, rebuilding who we are. I can't be the person I used to be, and you can't be the person you were before. We have to start over, as something new. Jacob swallowed hard, his heart aching with the weight of her words. He had thought that time and words alone would heal the rift between them. But Ava was right. This wasn't just about apologies. It was about transformation. It was about change. I'm willing to start over, Ava, Jacob said, his voice steady now, more certain than he had ever felt. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild us. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose what we had. I've spent so much of my life chasing success, but I never realized that what I needed most was right here, with you. Ava met his gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a softness in her eyes, a flicker of something real. She didn't smile, but there was a sense of openness between them, a crack in the wall that had been between them for so long. I don't know if I can believe you yet, she said quietly, her voice filled with uncertainty. But I'm willing to try, Jacob. I'm willing to give us a chance. But you need to understand that this isn't something that will be fixed overnight. It's going to take work. It's going to take effort. And we're going to have to be honest with each other. Jacob nodded, his heart lifting just a little at her words. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for, but it was a start. And after everything they had been through, that was more than enough. The days that followed were slow and steady. Jacob and Ava began to rebuild, piece by piece. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the pain of the past threatened to pull them apart again. But they kept trying. They went to counseling together, spent more time with each other, and slowly began to reconnect, not just as partners, but as individuals who had lost their way, but now had a chance to find themselves again. It wasn't just their relationship that was healing. Jacob was healing too. For the first time in years, he began to take a step back from his empire, focusing less on the constant grind and more on the things that truly mattered. He spent more time with Ava, rediscovered his love for the simple moments, and started to listen to her, not just as his wife, but as a person in her own right. And as they both worked to rebuild, Jacob realized something that he hadn't understood before. The real success in life wasn't about the deals or the power or the wealth. It was about the relationships you built, the people you loved, and the people who loved you in return. It was about finding balance, understanding, and the willingness to change. Ava had been right. Their love wasn't a simple fix. It wasn't something that could be fixed with grand gestures or empty promises. But it was worth fighting for, worth rebuilding, one step at a time. And as Jacob and Ava moved forward, side by side, they knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were no longer walking it alone. And that in itself was enough. Breaking free. The days blurred into weeks, and though the road ahead seemed uncertain, Jacob and Ava were slowly, cautiously, learning how to navigate their new reality. The conversations they had once avoided became their lifeline, a thread that pulled them out of the shadows of misunderstanding and back into the light of connection. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of their past mistakes seemed too heavy to bear, when the emotional scars from years of neglect threatened to overwhelm them both. But for the first time in a long while, Jacob felt a glimmer of hope. He had been so consumed by the idea of success, of building something monumental, that he had failed to notice the most important thing, the person who had been there all along, quietly fading into the background. And now, as they slowly but steadily began to rebuild their marriage, Jacob realized that it wasn't just about fixing what had been broken between them. It was about rediscovering who they were, both as individuals and as a couple. It was about allowing themselves the space to heal, to grow, and to make the painful but necessary adjustments that would help them build something stronger than before. Jacob was sitting at his desk, staring at a blank screen. His office was still as pristine as ever, the glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city that he had spent years conquering. But today, something felt different. The room no longer felt like a symbol of achievement. It felt empty, devoid of meaning. His empire, for all its grandeur, had started to feel like a cage. He ran his fingers over the edge of the desk, his mind wandering. His thoughts kept returning to Ava. There were still moments of tension between them, moments when the old wounds resurfaced, but those moments were fewer now. They were slowly finding a way back to each other, but he knew it would take time. There was no magic fix, no quick resolution. The phone on his desk buzzed, pulling him out of his reverie. It was his assistant, reminding him of the meeting that had been scheduled for the afternoon. The usual cycle, the endless flow of phone calls, meetings, and reports, had never seemed more exhausting. It felt like a never-ending loop, a hamster wheel he had been running on for years. For the first time in a long while, Jacob felt an overwhelming sense of fatigue. Not physical fatigue, but something deeper, emotional exhaustion. He looked at the phone, the responsibility and the pressure bearing down on him. But something inside him shifted. He could no longer ignore it. He picked up the phone, pressing the speaker button. Cancel all my meetings for the rest of the week. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sir, are you sure? We have several high-priority clients. Unsure, Jacob replied firmly, cutting off the protest before it could fully form. Cancel them all. I'm taking some time off. I'll handle the rest when I'm ready. He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. He had never taken a break like this before, never stepped away from the constant pressure, the demands, the need to perform. But now, more than ever, he understood that the things that truly mattered weren't the deals or the meetings. They were the people in his life, the ones who loved him, the ones who needed him, the ones who had been lost in the whirlwind of his ambition. It was time to step back, to find balance, and to rebuild himself, not just for Ava, but for himself. Ava, too, had been struggling with the idea of what her life could be without the shadow of their broken marriage hanging over it. She had been forced to reckon with her own feelings of inadequacy and resentment, but it was a painful process. In the quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, Ava would ask herself the same questions. What do I want? Who am I without him? In the past, her identity had been so tied up in their life together that it had been hard to even consider what she needed outside of him. But as their marriage slowly healed, as she began to rediscover the woman she had been before, she realized that she was more than just Jacob's wife. She was her own person, with her own dreams, desires, and purpose. She spent long hours reflecting on what she wanted out of life, apart from the roles she had been assigned. And though she didn't have all the answers, she knew that she needed to find her own path, one that wasn't shaped by the expectations of others, one that wasn't tied to the success of a man, no matter how much she loved him. It was a terrifying realization, but it was also freeing. For the first time in years, Eva allowed herself to dream again. She dusted off old sketches of things she used to want to do, ideas she had put on the shelf when life had become too chaotic. She spent afternoons painting again, something she hadn't done in so long. She reconnected with old friends she had lost touch with while she had been consumed with their life together. She explored hobbies she had set aside and found a sense of peace in the things she loved. But the process was not without its challenges. Each time she let go of a part of herself that had once been defined by her marriage to Jacob, she felt a pang of guilt. It felt like a betrayal, as if she were walking away from the life she had built with him. But deep down, Eva knew that it wasn't a betrayal. It was a necessary step for her to become whole again, to rebuild her own identity in the aftermath of their struggles. One weekend, Jacob and Eva decided to take a trip to a small town outside the city, a place neither of them had been in years. It was an impromptu decision, one that didn't involve business or deadlines. Just the two of them, alone, with no distractions. They spent the day hiking through the nearby woods, the quiet serenity of the natural world providing a much-needed respite from the noise of their lives. As they walked side by side, the silence between them felt comfortable for the first time in months. There were no expectations, no underlying tension. It was just them, moving forward together, without the weight of their past hanging over them. At the summit of the hike, they found a quiet spot to sit. The view was breathtaking. The town nestled in the valley below, the mountains rising in the distance. Eva leaned back against a rock, closing her eyes and breathing in the fresh, crisp air. For a moment, she felt at peace. Jacob sat beside her, his gaze distant as he took in the beauty of the landscape. After a few minutes, he turned to her. "I've been thinking," he began quietly, his voice reflective. "I spent so many years building something that I thought would make me happy. But I'm realizing now that what really matters isn't the empire I've built. It's the people who stand beside me. It's you, Ava. And I've been blind to that for far too long." Ava opened her eyes and turned to him. "You don't have to keep apologizing, Jacob. We've said it all already." "I know," he replied, his voice soft but earnest. "But I've been looking at everything the wrong way. I thought that success would fix everything, but it didn't. I realize now that what we need isn't more wealth or more power. It's time. It's presence. It's being there for each other, not just as partners, but as two people who have rediscovered what really matters." Ava's lips twitched into a small smile. "I'm not sure we'll ever be the same as we were. We've both changed too much." Jacob nodded. "I don't think we need to be the same. We're different now, and that's okay. I just want to keep trying. I want to be better, for you and for myself. I don't want to keep pretending that success is all that matters." Ava looked at him for a long time, her expression thoughtful. "You're right. We've both changed. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we can build something new, something that's ours. Not based on what we had before, but on what we can create now." Jacob reached out, taking her hand in his. The warmth of her touch grounded him, reminding him of the love they shared, even amidst the wreckage of their past. They didn't have all the answers yet. There were still challenges ahead. But for the first time, they were looking at the future with open eyes, ready to walk forward together. And in that moment, Jacob realized that the real freedom wasn't in success, wasn't in conquering the world. It was in being able to truly see the people who mattered most. It was in the quiet moments, like this one, when they were simply themselves, finding a way forward in the aftermath of everything. And perhaps that was the greatest success of all.